In this video, I want to go over the different game settings. There's tons of different options here, and I want to share my experience with how they change the game feel. So hopefully you'll be able to customize these settings and get the best experience for you. One of the problems that can happen with setting up the game is a lot of these settings take a long time until you start to really feel their impact. And because you can't change them midway through a playthrough, if you mess this part up and you're not happy with your settings, you could be 10 hours into a run and then kind of you're not happy with it. It's either too easy or too hard or whatever else the problem is. And it can suck to have to give up after investing that much into a run. So it's important to get these settings right. Instead of just going through these settings one by one, I want to kind of talk about different categories like performance, game pacing, difficulty, and cover each of the settings that make a major impact on those different things. And also the interaction between different settings, how they affect each other. So I'm going to start with performance because that's the most straightforward. The more calculations that your game needs to make, the more demanding it is going to be on your computer. Most of these settings already have a warning on them, so it should be pretty straightforward. The main ones for this are galaxy size, these two settings which affect pop growth, so logistic growth ceiling and growth required scaling, and then naval capacity and habitable worlds. But what I really want to talk about is more game balance. There's many different ways to play the game, but kind of at its heart, I'd say Stellaris is very much a sandbox game. It does have some established lore of its own, but generally speaking, you can customize it to tell the kind of sci-fi story you want. Like if you want something that feels more like Star Trek, you could definitely build your game to work that way, or whether you're doing something more like Warhammer 40k. I think it's helpful to think about what kind of playthrough do you want and build everything around that. Like even before getting into the settings, like building your empire around the type of playthrough you want. Are you going to be going for a hyper-aggressive galactic conquest type playthrough? Are you going to go for something more diplomatic? Like if you are going to be doing a galactic conquest, for example, the bigger the galaxy, the longer that's going to take. I would recommend shrinking the galaxy to make that more manageable and less tedious. So the next thing I want to talk about is game pacing. What stages of the gameplay do you like the most? Do you like that early game exploration where you haven't really made first contact with anyone? Or do you prefer the later game where it's really about diplomacy and warfare and interacting with empires? If you want to lean more towards that exploration phase, you can decrease the amount of AI empires, making the galaxy more sparsely populated. This setting here is relative to the galaxy size. So I like to think of this as kind of a density slider. And then the inverse of this, if you don't really like exploring as much, then you can increase this and have a more densely packed galaxy. So for example, like a way that you could combine some of these different settings together, if you want to create a galaxy that feels very vast and like there's a lot to explore, maybe increase the size of the galaxy, but decrease the amount of empires in it to make it more sparsely populated, and then also decrease the amount of habitable worlds, so that there's lots of empty space and the worlds that you do find are very precious and rare. And this also kind of balances the performance of having a larger galaxy. And if you're going to lean into this playstyle, maybe consider turning off guaranteed habitable worlds so you don't know what you're going to get. And it can lead to some interesting decisions, like maybe settling on a lower habitability world because that's all you have available to you. Another major impact for game pacing is technology and tradition cost. Decreasing this will make you research technology faster, so you get to those late game techs earlier. A full playthrough can take quite a bit of time, and maybe you're not able to commit to that. So dropping this can be a nice way of still getting to experience some of that endgame content in a reasonable amount of time. The other major effect on pacing is the galaxy size. Bigger galaxies are going to take longer to traverse. So if we look like a smaller galaxy and, we want to move over here, 1,500 days to get across the entire galaxy, more or less. And that's with just the baseline tech. As you start upgrading your ships to move faster through various means, you're going to kind of shrink the size of the galaxy, so to say. Whereas comparing that to a huge galaxy, since we're kind of in the center here, to just get to up here, it's like halfway across the galaxy is 2,600 days. Compared to the 1,500 for the whole galaxy, There's also kind of mental bandwidth as well. If you're fighting on a bigger galaxy and you have like a huge empire and 30 different fleets and you're fighting, 20 different wars on all these different fronts, it's easier to just forget about things and to get overwhelmed. Oops, there's that one wormhole somewhere that I totally forgot to look at, and then now you have a fleet where you didn't expect them, so it's easier to kind of get overwhelmed with decisions, and you're hopping between the galaxy, and managing it all gets more intense as well. I feel like there's generally a tendency to think that bigger is better, or at least that's something I fell victim to a lot of the times. I feel like maybe other people have this experience too, of like, it's bigger, so it's more epic, and thus it's more fun. But I've personally found that I really enjoy the smaller things that are more condensed and to the point. Big games can just drag on and get very tedious. I find this dynamic of really wanting to play on bigger galaxies happen particularly with Stellaris because space is huge. Like 1,000 stars is nothing compared to our actual galaxy in real life. And so it can kind of feel a bit weird that even the biggest galaxy size is like pitiful compared to the true scale of the galaxy. Now, obviously simulating over 100 billion stars, most computers would maybe kind of struggle to run that. I think they kind of mention this in the lore, but the way that I kind of justify it is that there are all of these stars, but the hyperlane network doesn't connect up to all of them, so that's why there's so few stars that you can actually access through the hyperlane network. That also kind of explains why sometimes new systems will form mid-game, as in, oh, we discovered a new hyperlane route to that star that already was there. All of this to say in a very long-winded way that my favorite playthroughs of Stellaris have typically been on the small galaxy size. Like, for example, the Cube Inc. playthrough that I did was on a small galaxy, and that was a lot of fun. I did a full galactic conquest. It felt like it was just the right size. I think if it was bigger, I wouldn't have enjoyed that playthrough as much. Now let's talk about difficulty, which has a whole lot of different things that affect it. There's, of course, this setting here, which just applies a flat bonus to either the player or the AI. In the advanced settings, you can tune this more specifically depending on what parts of the game you want to be more difficult. For example, if you want everything to be even in the early game so that you can get your foundations built, you can use scaling difficulty so that the AI don't get their bonuses right away on day one, but instead slowly get their bonuses over time until either the mid-game or the late game. And this scaling difficulty looks at the years you set down here. So this setting can be a good option for making sure that you don't just super snowball past the AI in the late game, but that the early game still stays balanced. Another thing that affects difficulty is how many advanced AI starts there are. Basically, this controls how many AI empires get a head start on things like technology, colonization, resources, and such. This pairs with the advanced neighbor setting, which controls whether they're allowed to spawn right next to a player. So for example, if you wanted every single AI empire in the galaxy to be an advanced empire, you have to make sure you check this on so that they can spawn. This could be nice to add some power imbalance to the galaxy. The more of these that there are, the further behind your empire is going to be relative to the galaxy. This basically is the opposite of scaling difficulty because it's a flat bonus at the start of the game that you can eventually overcome, whereas scaling difficulty only applies later into the game. Because the game is procedurally generated, a lot of difficulty can come down to the RNG. So I like to think of it as some of these settings kind of push the game more towards chaos, which means RNG has a bigger influence on how easy or hard the game is, versus a lower chaos, more stable setup that's more consistent every single time, and thus RNG is less of a variable. In high chaos settings, you could get really lucky and have an exceptionally easy game, but with those same settings, if you roll it again, you get a really hard start. Whereas a stable thing is going to be about the same every single time. So for example, galaxy shape is a big one for that. Elliptical is very evenly distributed. Where you spawn in the galaxy on elliptical isn't going to make that big of an impact. The effect of this is far more obvious on some of these other shapes. For example, to go to another extreme, we have barred spiral. And this kind of galaxy is split into two halves. You have this upper northern half and then this other southern half. And there's not many connections between these two parts of the galaxy. For example, with this one, there's only a single pathway between these two entire sides. And we also happen to have a fallen empire spawn right here, which closed their borders to us, cutting us off from the other half of the galaxy. So in this case, something like a wormhole connecting these two sides up is way more impactful than it would be on elliptical, If you manage to capture one of these choke points and put a starbase on it, that could be an amazing defensive position. So where you spawn will have a bigger effect on your game. Basically, it's more dynamic, which can be both a good thing and a bad thing. So from my experience with these different galaxy shapes, Barred Spiral, Starburst, and Spoked have kind of the biggest chaos factor. Elliptical is the most even, and then things like the Spirals, Ring, and Cartwheel are all somewhere kind of in between. Another thing that affects that kind of chaos factor is empire placement, whether you have random or clusters. Random basically leads to empires being evenly spread across the galaxy, whereas clusters, you have some empires closer together. This is a good example. These 4 empires are all very close together, but then there's big gaps in between the little more tightly populated sections of the galaxy. Say what might happen here is the Commonwealth of Man, say, expands down this way and then bumps up into this empire. And then they expand down this way and bump up into this empire. But they go north and there's no one here. So they have tons of room to expand in this direction. So clusters kind of gets you a balance between meeting some empires early, but also still having lots of room to expand. This is what random looks like. Everyone's spread out pretty evenly. So the next one I want to talk about is navigability. The big one that has an impact on this is hyperlane density. This, if you decrease it, you're going to have more choke points, and it's going to take you longer to travel kind of the same distance because there's going to be less hyperlane connections. These 2 stars don't connect up. So if you wanted to go from this star right here to this star, you're going to have to go all the way around this way. Having more hyperlanes are going to reduce the amount of choke points there are and make it easier to navigate through the galaxy. I personally feel that one thing that makes strategy games really interesting is terrain. It's something that I notice that space games always inherently struggle with because space is just so empty. Like for example in Hearts of Iron, trying to cross over the Alps is a very different experience to doing naval warfare over an ocean, or fighting like in the middle of Siberia. Stellaris doesn't really have that same kind of geographical variety. So the way the hyperlanes are connected up in different choke points and things like that are functionally the closest thing to terrain that Stellaris has. Because overall, each star doesn't really feel that different. There are a couple stars that have like turning off your shields or something like that. But for the most part, it's things like choke points that limit your expansion that gives you interesting choices to make. So something like this really flattens the game out, and I personally think it makes it less interesting. So there's one final thing I want to talk about, and it's actually not on the game details menu, but it's instead on the select empire menu. And on your custom empires here, there's this button here, which allows you to toggle between empire spawning being allowed, forced, or forbidden. So if you set it to allowed, one of your custom empires could show up potentially as an AI empire, but the thing that's really cool to do is to set it to forced. And if you do that, then you can see, instead of a question mark, we actually have Cube Inc. as one of the empires that will definitely show up in the galaxy. I think it's a lot of fun to make a bunch of custom empires and force them all to spawn. Doing this allows you to create really interesting galaxies, things that would never spawn naturally. One reason I really like doing this is sometimes the procedurally generated empires feel very incohesive or just seem really odd. Like maybe their portrait doesn't really fit their ethics very well. Like having a fanatic purifier butterfly just might not fit the theme of your playthrough. You could pick one of the more monstrous looking portraits to be the more evil empires if you want a more grounded, serious kind of style. If you're going to do this and force custom empires to spawn, one thing to note is that if you have 2 empires with the same starting solar system other than random, it can lead to a conflict. And it's a bit misleading because random trinary 1, random trinary 2, all of these ones, you can't have more than one empire with each of these. And then we're going to force this one to spawn as well as this one that has the same system. And we'll see this warning here. They both have the same starting system. So it's important to be aware of this. Ideally just set it to random, and that'll make sure that all of the empires you want to spawn will. So if we go ahead and do that, now we'll see both of these empires are spawning without any conflict. You can, however, have multiple of the same origin. So if you wanted to do something weird like everyone in the galaxy is a scion of a fallen empire, you can totally do that. we can see that all of these other empires throughout the galaxy are blue because they're fellow vassals of the same fallen empire, and we're all the same color. It'd basically be most of the game you wouldn't be allowed to declare war on anyone, and then it would kind of be like everyone's trying to build up to take on the fallen empire, and then like, I don't know, it's a weird playthrough idea. I don't necessarily think this particular setup would be a good idea, but I'm just trying to show some of the potential possibilities of the kind of things you could do. The game will never naturally give you a galaxy like this, so it can lead to some really unique playthroughs. Unfortunately, this screen does a pretty good job of showing you when there's going to be a problem. So like say if you don't have enough empire slots, it'll give you this little warning and stuff like that. If you have two different empires that have the same portrait and the same species name, the game will automatically detect that and put them as the same species. And the traits don't even need to be the same. It will actually just treat it as a subspecies. Kind of like what you get when you do genetic modification. To demonstrate, I made this species called 1 with this humanoid portrait. And if we look at all species, we can see there's 10,000 pops of this, even though we only have 5,000. And here is our second version, so it's a subspecies. And if they have the same traits, it will automatically add them into the exact same species. So if you wanted to have several empires of the same species, this is also an option. If you're going to do this, I would recommend thinking about the relative diplomacy of the galaxy. Like, it can be nice if you want some extra conflict in your game, make sure that you have empires with opposing ethics. Or you can make a very friendly, peaceful galaxy where everyone mostly has similar ethics and gets along. It does take a long time to set all of this up, figuring out all of the different empires you want to have. So admittedly, it's a slow process, and it definitely won't be for everyone. I think this is a great way of just adding more flavor and world building to your game. If you want to quickly be able to remove the fog of war to see what different galaxy setups actually look like, you can hit the tilde key to open up the console commands. And then you can hit communications, intel, and survey. Or alternatively, you can hit observe. So this will allow you to be able to see everything and get a feeling for what those settings look like in game. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.